The land where the Indus River bends and breathes is a place shaped by patience. Long before history learned to speak in crowns and conquests, water traced its slow paths through clay and silt, teaching the people who followed how to live with rhythm rather than force. Here, in the wide floodplains of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, a civilization emerged that seemed almost unwilling to announce itself. There were no towering palaces to scrape the sky. No colossal statues carved in the likeness of divine kings. No triumphal inscriptions proclaiming victory over rivals or gods. Instead, the Indus civilization built itself quietly, brick by brick, street by street, like a thought carefully arranged rather than a shout flung across time. When archaeologists first uncovered the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in the early 20th century, they were met not with the chaos of fallen empires, but with an unsettling calm. Streets stretched in straight, deliberate lines. Homes aligned with near-mathematical precision. Beneath the surface, drainage systems ran like hidden veins, carrying waste away with a sophistication unseen elsewhere in the ancient world. This was urban planning without precedent, and without ego. In most early civilizations, power announces itself loudly. Kings carve their names into stone. Gods demand temples that dwarf the human body, and cities revolve around the visible center of authority. But here, there is an absence so profound it becomes its own presence. No thrones, no royal tombs, no monuments that insist on remembrance. The Indus people left behind a world where order existed without spectacle. This absence has haunted scholars for over a century. Who ruled these cities, if anyone did? What belief system guided them, if not one anchored in towering sanctuaries? The evidence suggests a society organized not around singular power, but around shared systems. Standards of weight and measurement replicated across hundreds of miles, bricks molded to uniform ratios, cities constructed as if following an agreed-upon philosophy rather than a command. Power in the Indus world appears to have lived in cooperation. Their cities were not built to glorify individuals, but to serve daily life. Public baths, such as the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, hint at ritual and community rather than hierarchy. Homes, whether large or modest, shared similar layouts, suggesting a culture where disparity was present, but not violently pronounced. Even the most prominent structures do not dominate the skyline. They coexist within it. This quiet equality unsettles modern expectations. We are conditioned to believe that complexity requires domination, that civilization must rise on the shoulders of kings. The Indus challenges this assumption. It proposes another possibility, that humans can build enduring systems without placing a single figure at the center of meaning. Yet silence is not emptiness. The Indus people spoke, traded, worshipped, feared, and hoped as deeply as any other civilization. Their seals depict animals, bulls, elephants, mythical creatures, etched with care and repetition. These were not decorations alone, but symbols of identity, trade, perhaps belief. And yet, their script remains undeciphered, refusing to surrender its voice. It is as if the civilization chose to speak only in fragments, leaving us to listen between the lines. Anthropologically, this absence of visible kingship may reflect a psychological worldview rooted in balance rather than dominance. Living beside a river that could nourish or destroy without warning, the Indus people learned restraint. Floods demanded adaptation, not resistance. Survival depended on foresight, planning, and mutual responsibility. In such an environment, centralized tyranny may have been less effective than shared order. This was a civilization shaped by water, not merely sustained by it, but philosophically molded by its uncertainty. The Indus did not demand worship. It demanded respect. And in return, it offered fertility, trade routes, and continuity. To live here was to understand that control was an illusion, and harmony a necessity. We often imagine ancient people as driven by fear of gods and kings. But the Indus suggests a subtler psychology, one where meaning was embedded in routine, in cleanliness, in the careful alignment of streets with the cardinal directions. Perhaps belief was not something shouted from temples, but something practiced quietly each day, in how waste was removed, how water was stored, how neighbors shared walls. In this way, the civilization feels almost modern. Unnervingly so. It reflects a society that trusted systems more than personalities, infrastructure more than iconography. And yet, this very restraint may have contributed to its later erasure. Without monuments to capture imagination, without epic myths carved into stone, the Indus slipped easily into silence when it declined. History remembers those who announce themselves. It forgets those who whisper. And so the cities without kings remain, grids of brick beneath the earth, orderly even in ruin. Their streets still align. Their drains still follow gravity. Their homes still face one another in quiet symmetry. The people are gone, their language sealed away, their beliefs scattered like silt after a flood. But the philosophy of their world endures, etched not in words, but in design. They remind us that civilization does not always rise on thrones. Sometimes it rises in shared effort, in unseen labor, in the collective agreement to live by balance rather than fear. And sometimes, the greatest power a society can possess is the humility to leave no single name behind. In the end, the Indus civilization does not confront us with a tale of glory or conquest. It offers something more unsettling, a mirror, a vision of humanity capable of order without rulers, complexity without spectacle, greatness without gods carved in stone. And when the river changed and the balance broke, they did not rage against the world. They faded, quietly, deliberately, leaving behind cities that still wait patiently for us to understand what it means to build without kings. In the low, amber light of an ancient dawn, the cities of the Indus did not awaken to chaos. They awoke to lines, straight, measured, unwavering. Streets stretched forward with deliberate calm, intersecting at right angles as if the earth itself had agreed to be disciplined. There were no winding alleys shaped by accident or conquest, no monuments clawing toward the sky in defiance of gravity or gods. Instead, there was balance, a geometry so precise it feels, even now, like a quiet act of faith. This was a civilization that did not shout its power. It whispered it in brick and water. Long before Euclid named the rules of form, before philosophy tried to cage harmony in words, the people of the Indus lived inside an idea. That order was not imposed upon the world, but discovered within it. Their cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dhalavira, were not merely settlements. They were expressions of an inner logic, built to reflect a belief that life could be aligned, measured, and made whole. Every brick followed a ratio. Not roughly, not approximately, but with a consistency so exact it still unsettles archaeologists. Fired clay blocks shaped in the same proportions across cities separated by hundreds of miles. This was not coincidence. It was shared knowledge, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, a silent agreement on how the world should be assembled. Homes mirrored one another in quiet repetition. Courtyards opened inward, shielding family life from the public gaze. Privacy mattered here. Modesty too. The Indus people did not design their cities to glorify the few. They shaped them to sustain the many. No palaces rose above the rest. No tombs proclaimed divine lineage. Power, if it existed, was invisible, embedded in systems rather than faces. And then there was water. Water moved through these cities with an elegance that feels almost ceremonial. Covered drains ran beneath the streets, sloped with mathematical care, carrying waste away without spectacle. Wells punctuated neighborhoods with steady reassurance, offering clean water not as privilege, but as expectation. In an ancient world where disease and decay stalked dense populations, the Indus chose foresight over fear. This was sanitation as philosophy. Water was controlled, guided, respected. It was not allowed to fester, nor worshipped as a god demanding sacrifice. Instead, it became a partner, channeled, understood, trusted. In this relationship between human design and natural force, we glimpse something rare. A civilization that did not seek dominance over its environment, but conversation with it. Yet for all this precision, there is an absence that haunts the ruins. No inscriptions explain these choices. No tablets proclaim a sacred geometry. No hymns survive to praise alignment and flow. The Indus script, stamped onto seals and fragments, remains stubbornly silent. Its symbols stare back at us like closed eyes. Meaning is present but unreachable. And so we are left to read the cities themselves as text. What does it mean when a civilization invests so deeply in order, but leaves no words to defend it? Perhaps this harmony was not debated but assumed. Perhaps order was not ideology but instinct, a lived truth as natural as breathing. Anthropologists have long noted that societies reveal their values not in what they celebrate, but in what they normalize. For the Indus, normalization was equality of infrastructure. Streets did not narrow as they approached poorer quarters. Drainage did not fail at the margins. The same standards applied everywhere, suggesting a collective identity stronger than individual ambition. This does not mean the Indus world was without hierarchy. No civilization is. But here authority did not demand visibility. Control may have flowed quietly like water beneath stone, present, essential, unseen. Psychologically, such environments shape people. To grow up surrounded by right angles and reliable systems is to internalize stability. Predictability becomes safety. Order becomes moral. Chaos, then, is not merely dangerous, it is sacrilegious. In this way, the geometry of the Indus was not just architectural. It was cognitive. It trained the mind to expect balance, to trust structure, to believe that the world, if properly aligned, would not betray you. But the earth does not always honor our expectations. The same rivers that once fed these perfect grids would later shift, fracture, and abandon them. And when that happened, when water refused to follow its assigned paths, the sacred order began to crack. Yet in this chapter of their story, before collapse and silence, the Indus civilization stands as a quiet counterpoint to so many others. Where Mesopotamia raised ziggurats to bridge heaven and earth, the Indus leveled its ground. Where Egypt carved eternity into stone faces, the Indus refined the unseen, drains, wells, measurements. This was a people more concerned with continuity than immortality. And perhaps that is why their legacy feels so fragile. Empires built on spectacle leave ruins that demand attention. But a civilization built on harmony leaves only the question of how it ever existed at all. To walk the ruins today is to feel an uncanny calm. The streets are empty, but not violent. The walls are broken, but not angry. There is no sense of sudden death here, only departure. As if the people who lived within this geometry sensed when its balance could no longer be maintained, and chose to step away rather than let it shatter. Order, after all, requires cooperation, not just between people but between humanity and nature. When that pact is broken, even the most perfect lines lose their meaning. And yet, thousands of years later, the geometry still speaks. It speaks in our obsession with grids and zoning, in our pursuit of clean water and equitable design. It speaks in the quiet belief that a well-ordered world is a humane one. The Indus did not leave us a mythology of gods and monsters, but they left us a blueprint of restraint. A reminder that civilization does not begin with conquest or crowns, but with a simple, profound decision to arrange life so that it flows. In the end, the geometry of harmony was never meant to last forever. It was meant to be lived, carefully, collectively, and without witness. And when it faded, it did so without spectacle, leaving behind only aligned stones and the unsettling thought that the most advanced societies are not always the loudest. Some are measured, some are quiet, and some disappear so gently that history almost forgets they were ever there at all. In the dust-laden ruins of the Indus world, where brick walls still remember the weight of vanished hands, there exists a language that refuses to speak. It does not cry out from broken monuments or declare itself in epic inscriptions. Instead it whispers, pressed softly into clay, etched into stone no larger than a human palm. These are the seals of the Indus civilization. Small, deliberate objects that carry the unbearable weight of silence. They are easy to overlook at first. Square or rectangular, polished steatite, carved with animals both familiar and strange. A humped bull standing in patient stillness, a horned figure seated in enigmatic repose, creatures that seem half real and half symbolic. Above them a line of symbols, few in number, perfectly aligned, repeated across cities separated by hundreds of miles. A script without sound, a message without a voice. To archaeologists, these seals are artifacts of administration, tools of trade, markers of ownership, tokens of authority. They likely traveled with merchants, stamped onto goods bound for distant lands, pressed into clay to signify origin and trust. In Mesopotamia, similar seals told stories of kings and gods. They named rulers, invoked divine protection, recorded transactions meant to endure. But the Indus seals do none of this. They name no kings we can recognize. They praise no gods we can identify. They offer symbols, not sentences. And so we are left with the unsettling truth. This civilization spoke to itself in a language we cannot hear. The Indus script remains one of humanity's great undeciphered systems. Hundreds of symbols, yet no long texts. No bilingual inscriptions to serve as a Rosetta Stone. No mythic epics carved into stone. What survives is repetition, careful, restrained, almost ritualistic. This was not a language meant to dominate space. It was not carved into mountains or shouted across empires. It lived quietly, carried in pockets, pressed briefly into soft clay, then released back into the flow of daily life. Perhaps this was intentional. The people of the Indus Valley did not build monuments to immortality. Their cities were marvels of planning, sanitation, and balance, yet they lacked the towering proclamations of power that defined other ancient worlds. No pyramids, no colossal statues, no royal tombs overflowing with gold. Their seals follow the same philosophy. They are intimate objects, personal, controlled, and ephemeral. They suggest a society that valued function over spectacle, order over mythic display. Yet within their restraint lies mystery. The animals carved onto these seals stare back at us across 4,000 years with an unsettling calm. The bull, repeated endlessly, may represent strength, fertility, or economic wealth. The unicorn, an animal that never existed yet appears with haunting consistency, may symbolize something deeply sacred, or something entirely practical. Plan, profession, concept lost to time. The horned figure, seated in a yogic posture, has been interpreted as a proto-deity, a shaman, a lord of animals. Or perhaps it is none of these. Perhaps it is simply a symbol of identity, stripped of the mythic projections we desperately want to impose. This is the danger of silence. It invites us to speak for it. For generations, scholars have tried to force meaning from these symbols. Some see echoes of later South Asian religions. Others argue for purely economic functions. Statistical models analyze symbol frequency, searching for grammar where there may be none. Is it a true writing system, or a set of mnemonic signs? Does it encode speech or ideas? No consensus emerges. Each theory collapses into the same void, the absence of confirmation. And yet, meaning survives. Even without translation, the seals tell us something profound about the human mind. They reveal a civilization that understood identity as something that could be symbolized, compressed, and shared. A world where trust was mediated not by spoken oath, but by mark and sign. Where belonging could be carried in the palm of a hand. In this sense, the seals are psychological artifacts. They show us how humans create order, not just in cities but in thought. There is also a quiet humility in their design. The script never grows long, never demands attention, does not seek permanence. This is not the language of conquest. It is the language of coexistence, a tool for navigating complexity without dominating it. In a civilization without visible kings, the seals may have functioned as distributed authority, identity without hierarchy, recognition without rule. And then abruptly they disappear. As the Indus cities were abandoned, as rivers shifted and trade routes collapsed, the seals vanish from the archaeological record. No evolution, no transition into later scripts. They do not transform, they simply stop. It is as if a collective decision was made to let the language die. Or perhaps the people who carried it scattered, dissolving into rural lives where seals were no longer needed, where writing itself became unnecessary. This raises a haunting possibility, that the Indus script did not fail, it was outgrown. In leaving their cities behind, the people of the Indus may have chosen survival over memory. And in doing so, they carried their knowledge orally, embodied in practice rather than text. Skills passed through hands. Beliefs lived rather than written. A culture that trusted memory more than monument. When later civilizations rose upon the same land, they did not inherit the script, only the silence it left behind. To modern minds, trained to equate writing with civilization, this feels like loss. But perhaps it is also a lesson. Not all knowledge seeks eternity. Not all meaning demands translation. Some truths are meant to move, to adapt, to fade rather than fossilize. The seals remind us that human expression is not always about being understood by the future. Sometimes it is only about being understood by one another, in the moment that matters. Today, these seals sit behind glass, labeled with numbers instead of names. We study them under lights, measure them, digitize them, hoping that one day they will finally speak. But perhaps their silence is the message. A reminder that entire worlds can exist without explaining themselves. That civilizations can be vast, intelligent, and deeply human, and still refuse to leave us a story we can read. The voices behind the seals are gone, but their restraint remains, pressed into stone, waiting, not to be solved but to be respected. Before there were cities, before brick and measure, before the careful geometry of streets and wells, there was the river. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if aware of the lives that would one day lean upon its patience. Snowmelt from distant mountains fed its veins. Seasonal rains taught it when to swell and when to retreat. In its silty breath, the land learned how to live. The Indus was not simply water moving toward the sea. It was a rhythm, ancient, dependable, and deeply remembered. Along its banks, human time learned to synchronize with natural time. Planting followed its rise. Harvest waited for its retreat. Life unfolded not in defiance of the river, but in conversation with it. To the people who built along its course, the Indus was not worshipped with towering temples or inscribed prayers. It was something quieter, more intimate. A presence felt under bare feet in wet soil. A certainty carried in each measured brick. A promise that returned, season after season, without needing to be named. Civilization here did not grow against nature. It grew inside it. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro rose not on cliffs or fortified hills, but low and open, trusting the floodplain that sustained them. Their planners understood the river's moods. Streets were laid to drain its excess. Wells were sunk deep to catch its memory long after the surface receded. Granaries stood ready for years when abundance faltered. This was a civilization built not on conquest but on prediction, on knowing the river well enough to believe it would always return as it had before. And for centuries it did. The Indus flooded gently, spreading fertile silt across fields like a slow, generous breath. Crops grew dense and reliable. Trade flourished outward, west to Mesopotamia, east into lands now lost to time. Seals stamped with animals and symbols traveled farther than the people who made them, carrying with them the quiet confidence of a world in balance. The river remembered its role, and the people trusted its memory. But rivers, like civilizations, do not forget everything. Beneath the surface of stability, the earth itself was changing. Tectonic plates shifted imperceptibly. Monsoon systems, once steady, now weakening, began to hesitate. Tributaries altered their courses. Some dried into ghost channels, faint scars across the land where water once moved with purpose. The river that had given life began to speak in unfamiliar rhythms. Floods grew erratic. Some years, the waters arrived too fiercely, overwhelming fields and breaking the careful harmony between excess and restraint. Other years they came too weak or not at all. The fertile silt thinned. The soil hardened. Wells reached deeper into memory, drawing water that no longer replenished itself. To an outsider, these changes might have seemed gradual, almost invisible. But to those whose lives were tuned to the river's pulse, they were unmistakable. The calendar of nature no longer matched the calendar of human expectation. The Indus had not turned violent. It had turned uncertain. And uncertainty, more than disaster, erodes civilizations from within. There is no evidence of sudden panic, no layers of ash marking a final catastrophe. Instead, the archaeology tells a quieter story. Repairs become irregular. Urban planning loosens. Standardized bricks, once identical across vast distances, begin to vary, as if the shared agreement of how to build had started to fray. People adapted, as humans always do. Fields shifted. Settlements moved eastward, following smaller rivers and more reliable rainfall. Cities once dense with life thinned, then emptied. Homes were abandoned carefully, doors left intact, belongings taken but structures preserved, as though their occupants believed they might return when the river remembered them again. But the river did not return as it once had. For generations, modern scholars sought invaders, enemies, apocalyptic floods to explain the Indus collapse. We searched for drama because we expect endings to be loud. Yet the river tells a different story, one of slow withdrawal, not destruction. Climate change did not arrive as a singular event. It arrived as a series of disappointments. Each missed flood weakened faith. Each failed harvest strained trust. Not trust in gods, for we do not know their gods, but trust in the world itself. In the assumption that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Psychologically, this is where civilizations begin to fracture. When nature breaks its patterns, belief must renegotiate its meaning. The Indus people had built their lives on predictability. Their social order, their trade networks, their urban density all assumed stability beneath their feet. As that stability wavered, so too did the invisible agreements that held society together. Why build a city if the river no longer promises to feed it? Why maintain streets, drains, and wells when the water that justified them retreats beyond reach? The answer for the Indus civilization was not resistance. It was release. Rather than collapsing inward through famine or war, the people of the Indus world dispersed outward. They chose smaller communities, closer to shifting water sources. They exchanged monumental permanence for flexible survival. Writing faded because centralized administration no longer served a scattered population. Standardization dissolved because shared systems gave way to local adaptation. The river, once the spine of a unified civilization, became a boundary between what had been and what could no longer be sustained. In this way, the Indus did not kill its people, taught them when to leave. There is a quiet dignity in that choice. No last stand, no mythic downfall, just a recognition passed silently from generation to generation that the world they knew was changing, and that survival sometimes requires letting go of greatness. The river remembered its older loyalties, to climate, to geology, to time beyond human planning. And in remembering, it forgot the cities that once trusted it completely. Today, dry riverbeds snake across the plains like faded memories. Satellite images reveal ghost channels, ancient paths of water that once carried life, now traced only by subtle changes in soil color. The Indus still flows, but its course has shifted, just as human history shifted with it. What remains of that civilization is not a lesson in hubris, but in humility. They did not defy nature. They listened. And when listening told them that permanence was no longer possible, they adapted, even if adaptation meant disappearance. The river remembers because the earth remembers. It carries within it the truth that all human certainty is temporary, balanced delicately upon forces far older and quieter than ourselves. Civilizations rise when they understand the rhythms beneath them. They fade when those rhythms change. And somewhere, beneath the modern flow of the Indus, the memory of a world built on trust still moves, silent, patient, and endlessly watching, reminding us that even the most harmonious civilizations live at the mercy of water that remembers longer than we do. In the long memory of the earth, destruction does not always arrive as fire or flood. Sometimes it comes as absence, a season that fails to return, a river that hesitates, a sky that forgets how to open. For the people of the Indus, the end did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived quietly, like breath thinning in an aging body. For centuries, the monsoon had been a promise written into the sky. Each year, winds carried moisture from distant oceans, bending clouds toward the plains. Rain fell with a measured generosity, swelling rivers, renewing fields, restoring the delicate pact between human order and natural rhythm. Cities rose in confidence beneath this cycle, not in defiance of nature, but in deep reliance upon it. The Indus civilization did not worship chaos, trusted patterns. Streets were laid out with mathematical calm. Bricks were fired to uniform dimensions. Drainage systems assumed that water would always come, and that it would always need to be guided, released, respected. This was a society that believed the world could be anticipated, that balance was not temporary, but eternal. But climate does not swear loyalty. Around the 3rd millennium BCE, subtle shifts began to stir across the region. The Great Monsoon System, an immense atmospheric engine shaped by temperature, land and sea, started to weaken. Rainfall grew unpredictable. Some years brought too little, others too much, and many arrived too late. The ancient certainty that had governed planting and harvest began to erode, grain by grain. Rivers, once reliable as memory, lost their discipline. The Indus itself shifted channels, while its sister rivers faltered or vanished entirely. The Ghaggar-Hakra, possibly once a mighty waterway, slowly receded into seasonal trickles, then into silence. Along its banks stood cities now stranded from the lifeblood that had justified their existence. This was not catastrophe in the cinematic sense. No single year marked the turning point. Instead, it was a long unraveling, decades, perhaps centuries of adjustment and disappointment. Fields that once yielded abundance returned diminishing harvests. Wells sank deeper. Granaries emptied more quickly than they could be refilled. Nature did not attack. It withdrew. And withdrawal is harder to fight than violence. Archaeological layers reveal no scorched earth from this era, no mass graves, no sudden architectural collapse. What they show instead is adaptation strained to its limit. Buildings repaired with poorer materials. Urban planning losing its precision. Craft traditions fading as resources thinned and attention shifted from trade to survival. The Indus people were not ignorant of environmental change. They had lived alongside floods, droughts, and seasonal unpredictability for generations. But the scale of this shift was different. It was systemic. A slow destabilization of the atmospheric rhythms upon which everything else depended. Psychologically, this kind of crisis cuts deeper than invasion. An enemy can be named. A battle can be fought. But when the sky itself becomes unreliable, meaning begins to fracture. Ritual loses its assurance. Knowledge passed down from elders falters. The future, once imagined with clarity, turns opaque. In many ancient societies, climate instability provoked myth. Gods angered, spirits offended, cosmic balance broken. Yet the Indus left us no written prayers of panic, no carved laments. Their response appears to have been quieter, more pragmatic. As water retreated, so did people. Urban centers thinned. Large cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were not violently abandoned, but gradually depopulated. Streets once crowded with trade fell silent. Wells dried, not overnight, but persistently enough to make permanence irrational. Families dismantled their lives carefully, carrying what could be moved, leaving behind what could not. This was not collapse as explosion. It was collapse as dispersal. Climate stress also unraveled trade. The Indus civilization was deeply connected to distant lands. Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf, Central Asia. These exchanges relied on surplus, extra grain, crafted goods, predictable production. As environmental pressure mounted, surplus disappeared. Trade routes narrowed, then closed. Economic isolation followed environmental instability, tightening the noose slowly, without spectacle. With less rain came less cohesion. Standardization, a hallmark of Indus culture, began to dissolve. Brick sizes varied. Weights lost uniformity. Writing faded from use, perhaps no longer necessary in smaller, localized communities, or perhaps abandoned when the administrative systems it supported no longer served a shrinking world. This is how civilizations often end. Not with the death of people but with the death of systems. The human cost of such a transformation is difficult to quantify. There are no chronicles of despair. No monuments to suffering. Yet one can imagine the quiet grief of watching ancestral lands lose their fertility. The psychological weight of realizing that the patterns your grandparents trusted no longer hold. The subtle erosion of confidence in the world itself. Modern science, peering backward through sediment cores and climate models, confirms what the ruins imply. Shifting monsoon dynamics altered the entire ecological framework of the region. Temperature changes in the northern hemisphere, movements in the intertropical convergence zone, and long-term aridification converged into a slow but decisive pressure. The Indus civilization was not destroyed by ignorance. It was undone by dependence. And dependence, when broken, leaves no villain, only loss. Yet there is dignity in how this society met its ending. Rather than cling to failing cities, people adapted. They moved eastward toward more reliable rainfall. They reshaped their lives into smaller agricultural communities. Cultural elements survived. Pottery styles, religious symbols, perhaps even echoes of language, carried quietly into the future. In this sense, the Indus did not vanish. Transformed. But transformation is rarely remembered as triumph. History favors ruins, battles, and kings. It remembers collapse when it is loud. The Indus collapse was almost inaudible, a fading rather than a fall. Climate had turned its face away, and in doing so, revealed a truth older than civilization itself. Human order is a negotiation, not a conquest. When the terms change, even the most harmonious systems must yield. Today, the empty streets of Indus cities lie beneath the sun, their bricks still aligned, their drains still precise. They wait in silence, bearing witness to a moment when the world did not end, only shifted, slowly, irrevocably. And in that silence, the past whispers a warning. Not all endings arrive as disasters. Some come as droughts of meaning, when the rhythms we trust simply stop returning. The streets did not end in fire. There are no layers of ash sealing this moment in time, no fractured weapons scattered in panic, no hurried graves marking a last stand. Instead, what the earth preserves is something far quieter, and far more unsettling. Cities standing whole, their geometry intact, their walls unbroken, homes still upright, doorways still open, and yet the people are gone. This is the silence that defines the final days of the Indus world. At Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dhalavira, and countless smaller settlements, archaeologists uncovered a pattern that defied the ancient script of collapse. Civilizations usually fall loudly, through invasion, rebellion, or catastrophe. But here, the evidence speaks of restraint, patience, of a people who did not flee in terror, but withdrew with intention. Wells, once the beating heart of these cities, tell the first part of the story. They are everywhere, brick-lined, meticulously engineered, placed within walking distance of nearly every home. Water was not a luxury in the Indus world. It was a right, a shared inheritance. And then, slowly, these wells fell silent. Sediment crept in. Water tables dropped. Buckets no longer echoed against stone. A city can survive many things. Cannot survive thirst. The streets, once worn smooth by bare feet and wooden carts, began to empty. Drainage channels, masterpieces of civic planning, continued to run, but for fewer households. Standardized bricks still aligned perfectly, but repairs became inconsistent. The rhythm of urban life faltered not all at once, but unevenly, like a heartbeat losing its strength. What is most haunting is what did not happen. There are no signs of looting, no smashed idols, no hurried burials left unmarked. Household goods were often taken, not abandoned. Tools disappear from workshops. Personal ornaments thin out over time. This was not a population caught unaware. This was a population that sensed change and chose to leave before the balance tipped too far. To understand this, we must abandon the modern image of collapse as sudden apocalypse. The Indus decline was not a single moment. It was a long farewell. Climate did not announce itself with thunder. It altered patterns quietly. The monsoon, once dependable, began to falter. Rains arrived late or not at all. Floods became erratic, sometimes destructive, sometimes absent. Rivers shifted their courses, abandoning fields that had fed generations. The Gagarhakra, once a vital artery, slowly dried into a memory etched into the soil. For a civilization built on predictability, on standardized weights, uniform bricks, regulated streets, this uncertainty was lethal. The Indus people did not worship chaos. Their cities were expressions of control, balance, and mutual reliance. When nature broke its covenant, the cities lost their reason to exist. Yet still, there is no panic in the archaeological record. Instead, we see adaptation. Urban density thins. Large cities fragment into neighborhoods, then into villages. People move eastward, toward more reliable rainfall. Farming practices shift. Crops change. The grand civic projects, public baths, massive platforms, dense urban cores, are abandoned not in ruin but in relevance. They no longer serve the lives being lived. This is perhaps the most human detail of all. The Indus people did not cling to monuments for the sake of legacy. They did not die defending walls that no longer protected them. When the city failed to nourish the body and spirit, they walked away. To us, raised on histories of conquest and kings, this feels alien. But the Indus civilization had always been different. No palaces, no royal tombs, no inscriptions praising rulers. Authority here was not concentrated, it was distributed. Power lived in systems, not individuals. And systems can be abandoned. Within homes, the story repeats itself. Hearts go cold. Courtyards fill with dust. Storage jars are removed, not left to rot. Some houses show evidence of reuse, temporary occupation, smaller families living within once larger spaces. Others are sealed and left untouched, as if closed with reverence. The absence of bodies is especially striking. In a sudden collapse, death leaves traces. Here, death is almost invisible. The people did not perish where they lived. They carried themselves elsewhere, into landscapes where archaeology grows faint, where mud brick dissolves, and memory survives only in fragments. It is tempting to imagine a single final procession, a city emptying itself in one slow exodus. But the truth is likely messier, quieter. Families leaving at different times. Some staying longer than others. Some hoping the rains would return. Some already convinced they would not. The Indus collapse was not a decision. It was a realization. And realization, unlike catastrophe, does not scream. It settles. Over generations, children grew up in worlds smaller than their grandparents knew. Streets that once bustled became shortcuts through ruins. Wells became landmarks rather than necessities. Stories were told of cities where water flowed endlessly and order reigned without effort. To those born after the decline, these stories may have sounded like myths. And perhaps this is where myth truly begins, not in monsters or gods, but in remembering a lost way of living. Modern scholars once struggled with this silence. Early theories demanded violence, an invasion, an enemy, a dramatic end worthy of textbooks. But the earth refused to cooperate with those assumptions. It offered no massacre, no battlefield, no triumph carved in stone. Only emptiness, only patience, only the unsettling idea that a civilization can end not because it is destroyed, but because it chooses to change. There is something deeply unsettling in this notion. It suggests that collapse does not always announce itself. That the signs are visible only to those living within them. That survival may require letting go of what once defined greatness. The abandoned streets of the Indus are not failures of planning or courage. They are evidence of restraint, of a culture unwilling to sacrifice lives to preserve stone. In a world that equates endurance with domination, this quiet exit feels almost sacred. And so the cities slept. Brick by brick, they were swallowed by silt and time. Rivers moved on. Empires rose elsewhere, loud and violent, leaving behind monuments that screamed their names into history. The Indus left nothing so obvious. No final inscription. No warning carved for the future. Just empty wells. And streets waiting for footsteps that never returned. In that absence lies their final lesson. Not about collapse, but about humility. About knowing when a way of life has reached its limit. About understanding that survival sometimes means leaving the city behind, carrying only memory, skill, and silence into the uncertain horizon. Civilizations do not always die in flame. Some simply walk away, and are never heard from again. For a long time, history preferred a loud ending. Civilizations, we were taught, fall beneath boots and banners, under the weight of conquest, fire, and blood. Ruins are easier to understand when they can be blamed on an enemy. A sword explains silence better than drought. An invader gives grief a face. So when the cities of the Indus fell quiet, scholars once searched for footprints in the ash. They imagined armies riding down from the northwest, alien gods in their wake, cleansing fire sweeping through streets of baked brick. The story was neat, violent, satisfying. A civilization erased by force. But the earth remembers differently. When archaeologists began to listen not to legend, but to soil, the ground told a quieter story. One without mass graves. Without scorched horizons. Without the chaotic violence that conquest leaves behind like a signature. Harappa. Mohenjo-Daro. Dhalavira. No collapsed walls hastily rebuilt. No layers of ash thick enough to mark annihilation. No weapons scattered in panic. No skeletal trauma whispering of slaughter. The cities did not scream. They simply stopped. The myth of invasion began to unravel not with revelation, but with absence. An absence of proof. An absence of violence. An absence so complete it demanded a different question. Not who destroyed them, but why they chose to leave. What archaeology revealed instead was fatigue. A civilization under strain does not collapse all at once. Thins. Frays at the edges. Systems once precise grow unreliable. Trade routes weaken. Crafts lose their uniformity. Scripts fall into disuse. Not because they are banned or burned, but because fewer hands remember how to carve them. In the later layers of Indus cities, bricks no longer follow perfect ratios. Weights vary. Seals grow crude. Urban planning, once almost obsessive in its order, loosens its grip. The harmony that defined this civilization does not shatter. Dissolves. This is not the mark of invasion. It is the mark of adaptation stretched beyond its limit. Climate, slow and indifferent, had already begun its quiet work. The monsoon, once a dependable rhythm, grew erratic. Rivers shifted their courses, some abandoning cities that had trusted them for centuries. Floods came where they should not. Drought lingered where fertility once reigned. The Indus people were skilled engineers. They adapted longer than most civilizations could have. They dug new wells, redirected water, adjusted crops, moved settlements gradually eastward, chasing the memory of rain. But adaptation has a cost. Each adjustment pulls at the fabric of society. When food becomes uncertain, trade becomes fragile. When trade weakens, cities lose their purpose. When cities lose meaning, people no longer fight to preserve them. This was not collapse by invasion. It was erosion by reality. And yet, for generations, history clung to the image of the conqueror. Why? Because the myth of invasion is comforting. Preserves the illusion of strength. It suggests the Indus civilization did not fail. It was defeated. That its systems were sound until an external force overwhelmed them. Invasion absolves nature. It absolves environment. It absolves the slow consequences of imbalance. More unsettling is the truth that no enemy came. The Indus world was undone by forces it could neither fight nor fully escape. Not by hatred but by indifference. Not by violence but by change. Psychologically, humans struggle with endings that lack drama. We prefer apocalypse to attrition, fire to fading, a single moment to centuries of quiet adjustment. But real collapse rarely announces itself. It arrives gradually like hunger. Archaeology shows people did not flee in terror. They left deliberately. Homes were cleared, tools taken, doors left open, streets abandoned without damage. This was not the aftermath of slaughter. It was the result of choice. A choice repeated generation after generation. Leave the city. Follow the water. Shrink the world. What vanished was not the people, but the urban dream. And here the myth of invasion reveals something deeper. Not about the Indus, but about us. Our need to believe that civilizations end only when struck down. Our refusal to accept that even the most sophisticated societies can simply become unsustainable. There is a subtle grief in this truth, because it means the Indus civilization did not die heroically. It endured quietly until endurance was no longer enough. It means collapse was not a moment, but a process, one lived by millions who adapted, compromised, and survived by letting go. The cities were not destroyed. They were outgrown. And so the invasion myth fades, replaced by a more uncomfortable image. Families packing what they could carry, walking away from streets their ancestors had laid with mathematical care. Leaving behind wells that no longer reached water. Leaving behind seals no longer needed. Leaving behind a language whose purpose had dissolved along with the cities that spoke it. History remembers conquerors because they leave monuments. The Indus left none. Only silence. And in that silence is a warning far more powerful than any tale of invasion. Civilizations are not always ended by enemies. Sometimes they are undone by balance tipping too far. By environments shifting faster than societies can adapt. By systems that require stability in a world that offers none. The Indus civilization did not fall to fire. It faded beneath the weight of time, climate, and human limits. And perhaps that is why its story unsettles us still. Because there is no villain to condemn. No battle to reenact. Only the quiet realization that even the most orderly world can unravel. Not with a scream, but with a decision to leave. In the end, no army erased the Indus. The earth changed. And the people listened. They did not leave behind a battlefield. No layers of ash. No toppled statues. No mass graves frozen in the posture of sudden death. What remains of the Indus world is something far more unsettling. A vast, deliberate quiet. When archaeologists first uncovered the cities of Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and Dhalavira, they expected to find the familiar fingerprints of collapse. Empires, as history teaches us, tend to die loudly. They burn. They are conquered. They are broken by force or spectacle. But here, amid the carefully laid bricks and empty streets, there was no evidence of invasion, no final act of violence etched into the soil. Instead, there was absence. The Indus civilization did not fall. Step back. Across centuries, something within this world loosened its grip on urban life. The great cities, once humming with water systems, workshops, and long-distance trade, began to thin. Wells fell dry. Streets gathered dust. Houses were not destroyed but left intact, as though their occupants closed the door knowing they would not return. This was not a moment. It was a process. As the climate shifted and rivers changed their ancient paths, the delicate balance that sustained urban density began to erode. The monsoon grew uncertain. Floods arrived without rhythm or not at all. Agriculture, once predictable enough to support tens of thousands within brick walls, became unreliable. Grain storage shrank. Surplus faded. And with it, the possibility of maintaining large centralized cities. But the people did not vanish. They adapted. The Indus world unraveled into smaller threads. Villages scattered farther east and south, settlements shaped less by geometry and more by necessity. Where once there were grid streets and standardized bricks, now there were flexible homes, built from materials that answered to the land rather than imposed order upon it. This transition left little for stone to remember. Urban ambition, so visible in the archaeological record, gave way to something quieter. Survival became local. Identity became intimate. Culture no longer demanded monumental architecture or standardized seals. It lived instead in hands, habits, and inherited knowledge. For historians, this is deeply uncomfortable. We are trained to recognize civilizations by their ruins. We trust stone more than memory. Yet the Indus people chose a path that history struggles to follow, a retreat that preserved life at the cost of visibility. By abandoning the city, they stepped outside the narrative structures that allow empires to be remembered. Their writing disappears around this time. Seals cease. Standard weights dissolve. The uniformity that once bound thousands into a shared system fractures into regional variation. To the archaeologist, this looks like decay. To the people living through it, it may have felt like relief. Cities demand obedience. They require coordination, surplus, hierarchy, and constant maintenance. When the environment no longer supports these demands, the city becomes a liability, a structure that consumes more than it gives. Walking away, then, is not failure. It is recognition. The Indus people understood something modern civilizations often resist. Permanence is not sacred. What mattered was not the survival of the city, but the survival of the people. Their beliefs, too, adapted to this quieter life. Indus spirituality had never been expressed through towering temples or divine kings. It was intimate, woven into domestic ritual, cleanliness, fertility, and the cycles of nature. Such a belief system did not require a city to exist. Could travel, and it did. Archaeological echoes of Indus symbols, mother figures, sacred animals, ritual bathing, linger in later South Asian traditions. Not as direct lineage, but as memory refracted through time. The civilization did not vanish. It dispersed, dissolving into the cultural soil from which new worlds would grow. This is why the Indus collapse feels so elusive. There is no single moment to point to, no catastrophe to dramatize. The end arrived as a slow recalibration of priorities. A civilization that had mastered water, trade, and urban order chose to relinquish them when they no longer served human life. It is tempting to mourn this as loss. To imagine what might have been if the rivers had stayed loyal, if the climate had held steady, if the cities had endured long enough to leave behind texts and epics and named kings. But that impulse reveals more about us than about them. We are drawn to endurance, to monuments that defy time. The Indus people were drawn to continuity of life, even if that continuity left no grand signature. Their silence is not emptiness. It is restraint. By walking away, they avoided the violent endings that consumed so many other ancient worlds. No mass starvation etched into bones. No desperate fortifications. No mythologized apocalypse. Instead, there is evidence of choice. Families relocating, communities reorganizing, knowledge carried forward without ceremony. History remembers collapse as drama, but survival often looks like disappearance. In this sense, the Indus civilization offers a rare and unsettling mirror. It asks whether our obsession with growth, centralization, and permanence is truly synonymous with success. It challenges the idea that a civilization must be visible to be meaningful, or monumental to be remembered. Their cities returned to earth. Their people did not. Somewhere beyond the ruins, in villages yet unexcavated and traditions long transformed, the Indus world continued. Unrecorded, uncelebrated, but alive. Its greatest achievement may not have been its bricks or its drainage systems, but its ability to let go. In the end, the Indus civilization did not leave behind a story carved in stone. It left behind a question. What does it mean to endure? And is the truest form of survival sometimes the courage to walk away? There are civilizations remembered by what they built toward the sky. Stone stairways rising into clouded air. Colossal faces carved to endure eternity. Temples designed to be seen from miles away. declaring to gods and men alike that power lived here. The Indus civilization left none of this behind. No pyramids crowned their cities. No ziggurats pierced the horizon. No sanctuaries marked by columns or altars demanded attention from the heavens. And yet, to assume an absence of faith would be to misunderstand a people whose beliefs were not elevated above daily life, but pressed gently into it. Here devotion did not tower. It whispered. Archaeology gives us fragments rather than monuments. Small clay figurines, pressed by human hands and hardened by fire. Many are unmistakably feminine. Wide hips, prominent breasts, adorned with headdresses of leaves or horns. They are not gods enthroned in majesty, but symbols of fertility, abundance, and continuity. Life not as conquest, but as renewal. Birth as sacred. The body as vessel, not shame. These figures were not housed in temples. They were held, kept, perhaps placed in homes. Their power was intimate, personal. Something you lived with rather than traveled to. Animals, too, emerge again and again from the ruins. Bulls carved into seals with patient strength. Unicorn-like beasts, mythic or misunderstood, standing in profile beside ritual objects. Creatures rendered not as trophies of domination, but as companions in a shared cosmic order. In the Indus world, humanity does not sit above nature. It exists within it. And then there is water. Water appears everywhere, not only as infrastructure but as ritual presence. Wells carefully lined with bricks. Baths engineered with extraordinary precision. Most striking of all, the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro. A sunken pool, sealed and drained with obsessive care. It does not resemble a place of leisure. Feels ceremonial, purifying. A space where the body entered water not to escape heat, but to cross a threshold. Cleanliness here was not vanity. It was moral architecture. To cleanse the body may have meant to align the self with an unseen order, to wash away not dirt alone but imbalance. In later South Asian traditions, purity and impurity would shape entire systems of belief. The Indus people may stand at the silent beginning of that long psychological inheritance. Yet no priestly class announces itself. No statues of gods preside over congregations. No inscriptions tell us how to pray or when. Whatever gods existed here did not demand spectacle. They asked for rhythm, routine, repetition. Faith in this world may have lived in gestures. The daily washing of hands, the careful preparation of food, the respectful handling of animals, the ordering of space. Belief as habit, ritual as muscle memory. This is perhaps why nothing remains that resembles a temple. A temple implies separation, sacred space set apart from the ordinary. But the Indus civilization appears to have made no such division. The sacred was not elsewhere. It was embedded in the home, the street, the well, the body itself. To pray was to live correctly. Even death leaves us uncertain. Burials are modest. Bodies laid carefully, often with simple goods. No grand tombs. No lavish offerings meant to impress an afterlife. The dead were acknowledged, respected, but not exalted. Memory mattered more than display. This restraint speaks to a worldview profoundly different from the civilizations that would later dominate historical memory. Where others sought immortality through stone, the Indus people may have trusted continuity itself. Generations flowing like water, replacing one another without rupture. And yet, their symbols hint at something deeper, something almost shamanic. Horned figures seated in yogic postures. Animals arranged in deliberate proximity. A sense that the boundary between human and beast, body and spirit, was permeable. Identity was not fixed. Could shift, transform. This was not a religion of commandments. It was a cosmology of balance. Psychologically, such belief systems are born not from fear of punishment, but from anxiety about harmony. When the world is fragile, dependent on rivers, seasons, monsoons, faith becomes a way of listening rather than demanding. You do not command nature. You negotiate with it. You align yourself to its moods. Perhaps that is why their gods did not need names carved in stone. To name is to fix. To fix is to claim mastery. The Indus people may have known better. Their silence is not emptiness. It is restraint. And that restraint haunts us. Because civilizations that leave no sermons force us to confront an uncomfortable question. How much of belief is performance? How much of religion exists to be seen rather than felt? The Indus Civilization offers an alternative memory, one where spirituality left no ruins because it was never meant to. When the cities emptied, when the rivers shifted and the people walked away, their faith did not collapse in flames. Traveled with them. Folded into gestures, carried in customs, dissolved into regional traditions that would later re-emerge under new names and symbols. Nothing dramatic marked its end. No idols smashed. No temples burned. Only silence. And yet, that silence continues to speak. It tells us that belief does not require grandeur to endure. That the most powerful gods may leave the faintest traces. That civilizations can be deeply spiritual without ever shouting their devotion into the sky. In the Indus world, the divine did not live above the people. It lived among them. And when they vanished from their cities, their gods vanished with them. Unbroken, unrecorded, and utterly human. Long before the clang of empire or the roar of conquest, the Indus cities thrived in a quiet web of connection, stitched together not by armies, but by rivers, roads, and the delicate handshakes of trade. From the bustling ports of Lothal to the granaries of Harappa, the heartbeat of the civilization pulsed with exchange. Copper from Oman, beads from distant Iran, carnelian from lands we can no longer name. Each object was a message, a proof that these people, hidden behind untranslatable seals, were not alone in the world. They were part of a vast, invisible lattice stretching from the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia to the highlands of Central Asia. And yet, as centuries passed, that lattice began to fray, thread by imperceptible thread, until even the strongest cities found themselves alone in a silence they had never known. The Indus, or Harappan, civilization was remarkable not for the monuments it left behind, but for the subtlety of its connectivity. Streets ran straight and homes mirrored one another, but the city's real arteries were not paved with stone. They were the rivers, the sea routes, the caravans that bore goods, ideas, and culture. Every traded object carried more than material value. It carried trust, ritual, and the implicit acknowledgement of a shared world. A carnelian bead was not merely ornamentation. It was a symbol of human ingenuity, of the quiet understanding that distant peoples, though separated by hundreds of miles, could speak the same language of craft and commerce. In these exchanges, we glimpse a society whose survival depended not on conquest or conquest's shadow, but on connection, cooperation, and the fragile bonds of distant trust. Yet these connections were delicate. They existed in balance with the rhythms of river and monsoon, with the rise and fall of water and the yield of soil. When the Indus River flooded, the wealth of a city could surge. When it shrank, famine and delay followed. Trade was never guaranteed. It was a pact with uncertainty, a dance with forces both human and natural. Over generations, as climate shifted and monsoons failed, the very veins that carried life through the cities began to constrict. Rivers silted, ports lost access to the sea, and caravans slowed under the strain of scarcity. Distance, once a challenge overcome by ingenuity and persistence, became an executioner of its own. The very arteries that had nurtured civilization now whispered the first intimations of its undoing. Archaeology paints this collapse not as an explosion of violence, but as a slow, inexorable withdrawal. Granaries emptied, seals disappeared, and trade artifacts become scarcer in the archaeological record. We can almost see the merchants standing on the banks of a drying river, weighing their options, watching the horizon for ships that never came, knowing that their connections to far-off lands were slipping like sand through fingers. For the first time, these cities, once nodes in a vast network of exchange, faced the terrifying solitude of isolation. Without trade, the city's economies faltered. Without contact, knowledge ceased to flow. What had once been a civilization defined by its reach now turned inward, shrinking, quieting, and eventually vanishing from memory. But the human toll of these lost connections was more than material. To be isolated is to feel the world contract, to sense the breadth of human possibility narrowing into the walls of one's own home. The artisans who crafted the delicate seals, the laborers who toiled in brick-lined streets, the sailors who navigated the uncertain waters, they were no longer participants in a larger story. Their accomplishments, once part of a chain that spanned continents, became private and invisible, their skills preserved only in fragments. The psychological weight of this solitude is difficult to measure, but it is not beyond our imagination. A civilization that had thrived on connection, suddenly severed from its companions, experienced a loss that was profound, intimate, and unrecorded. The grief of invisibility, the quiet terror of irrelevance, the haunting knowledge that their world was shrinking beneath their feet. Even as trade routes dwindled, the Indus cities continued to function, almost stubbornly, as if the rhythms of daily life could stave off the encroaching silence. Farmers sowed their fields, potters shaped clay. Children played along streets that still smelled of wet mud after the rain. Yet, like a pulse in a body losing blood, the vitality was waning. Every absent ship, every caravan that did not arrive, was a silent excision, cutting away at the veins of civilization. And just as the body eventually succumbs when sustenance ceases, so too did the Indus cities falter, not with fire or sword, but with absence. Absence of exchange, absence of novelty, absence of the reassurance that they were part of a broader human story. In imagining this loss, we are confronted with a subtle horror. Unlike the dramatic destructions often preserved in myth or legend, there are no screams, no burning temples, no triumphant invaders. Instead, there is a quiet unraveling, a civilization undone by the withdrawal of life's connective tissue, leaving cities standing but empty, wells dry, streets silent. The absence itself becomes the narrative, and the human imagination strains to fill the void with meaning. What does it mean for a society to vanish without violence? For a world to shrink, not by conquest, but by the slow erosion of contact? In this absence, the Indus civilization leaves its most haunting legacy, the reminder that human achievement is inseparable from the connections that sustain it. Trade, in its most profound sense, was not merely a matter of commerce, it was the heartbeat of a shared world. When the heartbeat slowed, the civilization could not survive. And yet, there is beauty even in this quiet collapse. It reminds us that our histories are not only stories of conquest or destruction but of subtle dependencies, of delicate webs whose fraying can end entire worlds. The Indus civilization's disappearance is a meditation on fragility, an echo of all societies that rise and fall in silence, and a reflection on the invisible threads that bind us across distance and time. By tracing the Indus trade routes into oblivion, we see both human ingenuity and human vulnerability, the brilliance of exchange, the poetry of distant cooperation, and the tragic inevitability of isolation. The cities may have vanished, but their memory persists in shards of pottery, in the remnants of docks and warehouses, in the geometry of streets that once carried life across continents. And in that persistence lies the lesson that civilizations, no matter how sophisticated, are not immortal. They are networks, fragile and mortal, and when the bonds are severed, even the greatest cities can be left to the quiet judgment of time. In the end, to walk through the ruins of Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro is to sense not only absence, but the echo of connectivity lost, the silent commerce of lives intertwined, the muted conversations of traders, the unsent messages carried across rivers and deserts. The Indus civilization did not fall with a roar. It receded like a tide, leaving its cities as monuments not to conquest, but to the fragile, ephemeral beauty of human connection. And in that fading heartbeat, we hear a warning reverberating across millennia. Even the strongest veins can run dry, and when they do, silence will follow, inexorable and absolute. In the dry, wind-swept plains where the Indus once flowed, the silence is profound. It is not the quiet of empty streets or crumbling walls, but a deeper, more unsettling absence. Archaeologists walk among the ruins, trowels in hand, eyes tracing the outlines of streets once ordered with such precision that they rivaled the most rigid geometries of the natural world. Yet here, in the dust and broken brick, there is no fire, no invasion, no violent end. What haunts these scholars is not the evidence of destruction, but the evidence of cessation. The cities simply stopped. It is a strange and terrible thing to study a civilization that disappears not in chaos, but in a gradual, almost imperceptible fading. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, those grand metropolises of the Indus, were marvels of urban planning. Brick laid with exacting care, water channeled through complex drains, homes aligned in perfect grids. They spoke of human ingenuity, of minds capable of imagining order where there was none, of society organized in harmony with the rhythms of life and river. And yet, over centuries, this careful orchestration unraveled, not with the roar of conquest, but with the quiet insistence of absence. The script of the Indus, etched upon countless seals and tablets, offers a puzzle that remains unsolved. For decades, scholars have attempted to decipher its symbols, believing that within the lines and curves might lie the voices of a people who vanished. But the language resists understanding. Its cessation is absolute. Writing abruptly ends. And with it, the knowledge of laws, commerce, myth, and memory disappears. It is as if the very act of communication, of inscribing thought into permanence, had been abandoned. The silence left in its wake is not merely the absence of words. It is the absence of continuity, the erosion of memory itself. This disappearance of standardization extends beyond the written word. Artifacts suggest a civilization once bound by shared measurements, weights, and protocols. Pottery shapes repeated with geometric precision, weights balanced with mathematical care, streets and homes laid out in meticulous conformity. There is a sense of a world intimately connected by invisible rules, a civilization held together by agreement and repetition. Yet, as the centuries passed, these conventions faltered. Standardized weights were no longer used. Bricks varied in size. Streets lost their ordered symmetry. What had once been a network of interlinked urban centers began to fragment. The harmony of the Indus world unraveled into regional echoes. Small settlements, isolated communities, each carrying fragments of a system that had once unified them. It is tempting to ask why such a civilization, so sophisticated, should dissolve into obscurity. And yet, perhaps this is the very lesson the Indus leaves for us, that even the most organized societies are fragile, subject to forces beyond human control. Climatic shifts, river migrations, soil exhaustion, or the slow, creeping erosion of social cohesion may have played their part. There is no single moment of catastrophe to point to, no king to overthrow, no army to blame. Instead, there is the unsettling notion that life, when severed from its sustaining patterns, simply changes course. The people did not vanish. They moved, adapted, dispersed. The cities became hushed monuments to human ambition, their streets echoing with the memory of lives once lived. Walking through Mohenjo-daro today, the emptiness feels intentional, almost deliberate. Wells lie dry, granaries crumble, and the great bath stands silent, a testament to ritual and gathering long ceased. One can almost sense the rhythm of daily life slowing, the footsteps of countless inhabitants fading into dust. It is not the sudden chaos of destruction that leaves a civilization haunted, but the quiet that follows its own decision to end. The absence becomes more than a void. It is a presence of its own, demanding contemplation, reflection, and awe. Humanity has long feared endings that are invisible, endings without spectacle. Wars can be narrated, empires can be named, monsters can be chased across storybooks. But the cessation of a civilization is quieter, and therefore more profound. It cannot be catalogued in chronicles or myths, for it leaves no characters to speak of, no dramas to retell. It is in this quiet withdrawal that the Indus civilization teaches a lesson we are only beginning to understand, that the absence of human activity is as telling as its presence. That in the archaeology of absence, silence is history's most eloquent voice. And yet, for all its silence, the Indus still speaks. Its bricks whisper of lives ordered by reason, by ritual, and by the subtle understanding that society is a delicate balance between people, river, and earth. Its ruins remind us that even without records, even without legend, human beings leave traces of care, ingenuity, and memory. In the absence of continuation, we glimpse the fragility of our own attempts at permanence. Cities rise, civilizations flourish, but time, unforgiving, indifferent, demands change and often a slow retreat into obscurity. As the sun sets over the plain, shadows stretch across the empty streets. The wind carries a faint echo of footsteps long gone, a distant murmur of life that once moved in harmony with the river's pulse. In this stillness, we are confronted not with stories of conquest or heroism, but with a profound absence of human intention, the cessation of order and communication. And in this absence lies a haunting beauty, a reminder that history is not only written in triumph, but also in withdrawal, in endings that leave only questions, and in silence that endures longer than memory itself. The archaeology of absence teaches that the end of a civilization is not always a spectacle. It is a slow, deliberate fading, a quiet resignation to forces too vast for even the most ordered of cities. And as we leave the ruins behind, we carry with us a reflection that is both unsettling and sublime. Sometimes, the most haunting stories are not those that shout across centuries, but those that whisper in silence, urging us to listen for what has stopped, for what will never return, and for the fragile, fleeting traces of human life that once dared to order the world. In the shifting dust of South Asia's river plains, there once lay a world so meticulously ordered, so quietly powerful, that its absence is more striking than its presence. Today, the traces of that civilization, called Harappan or simply the Indus Civilization, are little more than fragmented bricks, sun-bleached streets, and enigmatic seals. We wander among the echoes of their cities, where the wind moves unhindered through empty lanes, and yet in this silence, the scale of their achievement becomes almost unbearable. It is a civilization remembered more by what it left unspoken than by what it recorded. Unlike the empires that rise and fall with a bang, whose victories are inscribed on stone, sung in praise, or carved into monuments, the Indus people left no such declarations. There are no towering ziggurats of power, no imposing palaces designed to awe or intimidate. No chroniclers wrote of kings or generals. No poets immortalized wars or sieges. Their cities were anonymous, governed by rules that appear in the symmetry of their streets, the precision of their drainage systems, and the uniformity of their weights. Civilization here was not a matter of spectacle or dominion, but of order, harmony, and quiet collaboration. And yet, when the world turned and their rivers shifted, their legacy slipped through history's fingers like fine sand. The erasure is almost total. Without texts to translate, we can only speculate about the minds that shaped Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dhalavira, and the countless smaller settlements that once thrived along the Indus and its tributaries. Their seals, often engraved with figures of animals, mythic motifs, and strange symbols, hint at commerce, identity, and perhaps religious ritual, but the meanings are lost. Language itself has turned traitor, leaving the civilization's deepest thoughts as undecipherable as the shadows of their long-abandoned homes. And so, historians confront an almost unbearable absence, a civilization that flourished, connected distant lands through trade, and vanished without leaving the stories that make empires eternal. To understand why history forgot them, we must confront what makes history memorable. Most civilizations are immortalized through conquest, through the violence of memory. Empires endure because someone sings of victories, because rulers desire to etch themselves into eternity. Rome built roads to endure. Egypt carved pharaohs into stone to survive the centuries. But the Indus civilization, its grandeur lived in balance, in the quiet efficiency of urban life, not in the triumph of kings or gods. It was ephemeral in a sense, because it sought permanence not in power, but in people. The rhythms of labor, trade, and community, the silent devotion to order and predictability. When the river shifted and monsoons waned, those lives could not be memorialized in conquest, nor could they be recorded in chronicles designed to outlast mortality. Their survival depended on daily labor and fleeting rituals, not on the creation of monuments meant to defy time. Perhaps it is this very intimacy that doomed their memory. Civilizations that are remembered often seek attention. They demand to be chronicled, celebrated, or feared. The Indus world sought no such recognition. There were no kings to boast of their power, No temples to cement belief through monumental architecture, no armies to leave traces of conquest. History, which favors the loud, the bloody, and the spectacular, bypassed this civilization with almost casual neglect. Yet what is lost to history is not the measure of their ingenuity. In the meticulous planning of Mohenjo-Daro's streets, in the clever design of wells and reservoirs, in the standardized weights and measures used for trade across thousands of kilometers, we glimpse the contours of minds that understood order, fairness, and perhaps even justice, in ways that few empires have. The human reflection of their disappearance is haunting. To walk through the ruins is to confront mortality on a civilizational scale, not just of individuals but of collective dreams, ambitions, and knowledge. The Indus people had built cities that could survive the centuries, yet they could not survive the subtle shifts of environment, climate, and perhaps disease. Theirs was not a sudden collapse marked by fire and conquest, but a slow withdrawal, a quiet folding of life as the rivers failed to nourish crops and trade networks faltered. Their cities, once alive with the hum of commerce and domestic routine, became ghostly. And in that withdrawal, the civilization left questions, not answers. Fragments, not narratives. Silence, not song. In many ways, their story challenges our assumptions about what makes history. We equate significance with spectacle, survival with memory. Yet the Indus Civilization demonstrates that a society can be immensely complex, strikingly advanced, and utterly lost. Their absence is a mirror, reflecting our human obsession with recording, conquering, and declaring significance. In forgetting them, we are reminded of the fragility of cultural memory. How easily even the most sophisticated human endeavors can vanish if they are not framed for the eyes of posterity. Modern archaeology, with its careful brushes and meticulous mapping, can uncover their bricks, their pottery, and their forgotten streets. But the emotional, intellectual, and spiritual lives of those who inhabited these cities remain almost impenetrable. We can imagine children playing in shaded courtyards, merchants haggling over grain, artisans carving seals with delicate precision, but we can never hear the conversations, the stories, the dreams. All we have are traces, hints, and echoes of a humanity both familiar and alien. And in that liminal space between knowledge and imagination, the Indus civilization continues to speak, not through words but through absence. Perhaps there is a lesson hidden in this silence. Civilizations endure not because of monuments or armies, but because they inhabit the collective memory of those who follow. And when memory fails, when texts are lost, inscriptions fade, and oral traditions die, history forgets, leaving only traces that demand careful listening. The Indus civilization, in its quiet sophistication, challenges us to hear what is often overlooked: the human capacity for order, cooperation, and resilience, and the quiet fragility that accompanies all mortal achievements. In the end, history forgot them not because they were insignificant, but because their significance was not meant for the eyes of conquerors or the ears of chroniclers. Their cities fell silent, their streets empty, and yet, in the precise alignment of bricks and canals, in the enigmatic symbols on tiny seals, their memory lingers like a shadow at the edge of understanding. They are a reminder that not all greatness shouts, and not all survival is measured by conquest. Some civilizations endure only in whispers, and it is in listening to these whispers, in tracing the faint contours of absence, that we can begin to understand the profound human story they left behind. The Indus civilization may have been forgotten, but in the quiet study of their ruins, in the contemplation of their vanished streets and dry wells, we feel their presence still. In every abandoned lane, every undeciphered seal, there is a question. What did it mean to live in such order, to build with care and subtlety, and to leave behind a world that history itself could not hold? And perhaps, in that question, we glimpse the true weight of what it means to be remembered, or to be forgotten. In the fading light of a forgotten world, the cities of the Indus lay not in ruin, but in quiet absence. Stones rested where bustling streets once hummed with life, and the waters that had nurtured the civilization now whispered against empty banks. There were no battlefields, no scorched earth to mark catastrophe. Instead, there was a silence so profound, it seemed to hold the weight of centuries in its breath. It is in this quiet that the true story of the Indus collapse is told, not with the clamor of destruction, but with the gentle, inexorable withdrawal of a society attuned to the rhythms of the earth. For over a millennium, the Indus civilization had flourished along the great river plains, a mosaic of meticulously planned cities and fertile fields, of brick-lined streets and reservoirs that reflected the sky with an almost sacred precision. Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dhalavira, names that now echo only through archaeology, were once vibrant nodes of human ingenuity. Here, thousands lived in harmony with the river, guided by an unspoken order, a belief that balance was the highest virtue. Every street, every courtyard, every granary seemed arranged not only for practicality, but for a quiet, philosophical elegance, a civilization built on consensus rather than conquest. Yet the Indus people, for all their planning, were vulnerable to the most patient of adversaries: time and change. The monsoons that had nourished the plains began to shift. The river that had once brought life in predictable pulses now flowed with uncertainty. Floods came when they were not expected, and fertile lands slowly turned to dust under the indifferent sun. The climate did not strike with fury. It simply withdrew its favor, leaving once thriving cities teetering on the edge of survival. The Indus people responded not with defiance, but with adaptation, moving quietly, recalibrating their lives against the subtle threats of a changing world. It was a withdrawal, not a collapse. Wells dried, streets emptied, and granaries were left locked, not smashed. Signs of sudden violence are absent. Instead, we find evidence of careful departure, a civilization that sensed the future slipping through its fingers and chose to leave behind the structures of its achievement rather than see them desecrated by fate. Archaeologists uncover streets lined with empty homes, jars still on their shelves, the impressions of sandals in clay floors frozen as though their owners might return. There is an eerie patience here, as if the people themselves knew that the end was not a singular event, but a slow unraveling. In these silent cities, we encounter the profound human dimension of history's quietest tragedies. This was a society not undone by war or pestilence, but by choices made under pressure, by the realization that survival sometimes demands retreat. They walked away from their monuments, their waterworks, their carefully measured streets, not in panic, but in reasoned withdrawal. There is an unsettling grace in this decision, a reminder that human resilience is often measured not by triumph, but by the courage to abandon what cannot endure. The silence of the Indus also speaks to the fragility of memory. Without written chronicles to tell their story, without epic myths to carry their deeds across time, their culture faded from the consciousness of later civilizations. The bricks of their houses, the carved seals and beads, the subtle artistry of their urban planning, these are all that remain. From them, we try to reconstruct the lives, the hopes, and the quiet dignity of a civilization that refused to announce its own passing. Unlike empires remembered for their conquests, the Indus civilization is a whisper, a lesson that the most profound endings are not always dramatic, and that history often forgets those who leave no clamor behind. And yet, even in absence, there is communication. Archaeology becomes a language of ghosts, and the silence itself becomes testimony. Every empty street, every collapsed kiln, every abandoned well speaks of human choices, of communities that measured risk, observed the environment, and slowly retreated. There is a poetry in this quiet logic, a haunting wisdom that warns us. Civilizations are fragile not only to the forces that rage around them, but to the cumulative weight of small, deliberate decisions made across generations. To witness the Indus collapse is to witness patience and prudence collide with inevitability, and to understand that endings are not always loud. Some fade, like the river's memory, into the dust. Perhaps it is this very silence that holds the civilization's most enduring lesson. Unlike the conquests of Mesopotamia, the invasions of Persia, or the fiery demise of Troy, the Indus did not fall in spectacle. It vanished softly, leaving behind no banners or battlefields, no ruins burned by hatred. And in that quiet disappearance lies a deeper reflection on the human condition. Civilizations, no matter how sophisticated or orderly, are subject to the same forces that shape all life: impermanence, adaptation, and the inexorable hand of nature. The Indus teaches us that the measure of a culture is not only in its achievements, but in how it meets the slow erosion of circumstance, how it chooses to endure or to let go. The legacy of the Indus is subtle. It resides not in the triumphs that echo through history books, but in the choices that linger in memory like a shadow. The bricks, the granaries, the wells, all speak to a people who understood balance, foresight, and the impermanence of human endeavor. Their withdrawal was not defeat. It was survival in its most sober form. In watching them disappear, we are reminded that history is not composed only of dramatic collapses, but also of quiet endings, of societies that vanish without witness, leaving only a whisper for those who come after. And so, as we stand on the banks of the now silent Indus, watching the sun set across plains that were once alive with human intention, we are left with a haunting reflection. The collapse of this civilization was not a scream into the void, but a careful, deliberate fading, a civilization that chose silence over spectacle. Its story endures, not in grandeur, but in reverence. The dust that covers Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa carries not ruin, but memory. And in its quiet persistence, it still speaks, urging us to listen, to understand that empires do not always fall with fire and fury, and that the human heart, in its choices and in its departures, can be as decisive as any army or flood. In the end, the Indus civilization whispers across millennia, a silent echo that asks only for our attention. It reminds us that history is as much about what retreats as what conquers, that endings can be as gentle as a river's final sigh, and that some civilizations do not fall. They fade, leaving behind a silence that still speaks.